the number one enemy I face is buttons on a collared shirt, and being able to do things that was a lot easier in days past.
I'd like to begin by asking, what do you think is the one thing people need to be most aware of when they think about living with Parkinson's disease?
I think just the variability of the disease, it comes in so many different factions and divisions. To think you've seen one Parkinson's patient, you've only seen one Parkinson's patient. So it sometimes makes generalizing very difficult. I think the common theme for all of this is it's an incurable disease that people are absolutely committed, both caregivers and patients, diagnosed patients. So it's receiving a lot of interest. There's, a lot of hope in terms of research, but there's a long way to go as well. But again, I think probably the most unique finding is it is just so very different for many people in terms of how they're impacted by the disease.
I love that saying. If you know one person with Parkinson's disease, you know one person with Parkinson's disease. And I think that's really applicable to lots of different long-term conditions, isn't it? People think they know because they may know of somebody with that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's exactly that. It's you just know that one person, don't you?
Yeah. But it's also a good challenge because inevitably there's only there's a lot of definitions of Parkinson's of what it looks like. But again, I think, another challenge is that people sometimes don't know how to engage somebody with Parkinson's. They don't know if are they in pain or, are there's issues. So people sometimes are a little reticent to, have an engaged in discussion for fear of upsetting me or, saying something that's, wrong. Another kind of popular saying in PD is that, I might I might die. I'm going to die at some point, and I'll have Parkinson's, but it might not be because of Parkinson's. So that's always kind of a big feature that, Parkinson's isn't going to kill you. It's, there's other areas and other opportunities, but I think it's a lot of, engagement and discussion and, it takes a village.
So let's talk about family, Peter. Would you mind sharing with us a story or a scenario of how being diagnosed, your diagnosis of Parkinson's disease or PD, as you called it, has an impact on your family?
Sure. I'll start with the children. I have older children, roughly 23 and then 26. So, they're not quite, little kids anymore. I've been diagnosed for about 10 years. And I think, one of the positive aspects that I said is, having a discussion, with my son and daughter about my diagnosis, what they'll hear, what they'll read, what they'll, the questions they need to ask was very positive for that. And so much so that my daughter used that as a catalyst. She actually works in New York City, but she went and joined the Young Professionals Michael J. Fox Committee in New York, and she actually is quite active in terms of fundraising and kind of looking at events, recruiting other young professionals in terms of Parkinson's disease. So it's as a father, that's really heartening to see. I've raised a daughter that wants to give back, but B, it makes a real big difference. And so again, that's just one example of how PD is brought us together as a family, and I think my son feels some of the same ways, just in terms of not exactly sure what to ask, but always wants to know how I'm doing, how am I feeling. So I think it's good. It's generally speaking, it's been a well received opportunity with my children.
Excellent. And that's such a positive story as well, isn't it? The fact that your daughter particularly has used her experience and knowledge to go on and help other people is absolutely incredible.
It's been a great experience for me to participate in many ways. I'm actually sitting on the patient advisory board, so I get to see a lot of the global kind of work that's going on at the foundation. And then still, I've had other opportunities just kind of on a regional fundraising basis, being able to contribute and kind of raise funds. So, it's been good to get involved, and it's just, it's not necessarily going to guarantee a cure, but it'll keep me engaged and it'll keep the visibility up there, and it'll allow all of us to kind of rally behind a single focus in terms of how do we, really eradicate this in our future.
Yeah, and during that time of you being part of that community and on those boards and offering your experience, have you seen an improvement, an increase in understanding? What's your experience been in that period of time?
I think there's a general level of awareness. I think people are, I had another really a good friend of mine was just diagnosed with Parkinson's last week. And so, we were on the phone chatting and what to expect and recommendations. But I think it's become quite common. I mean, I think rarely can you run into somebody that doesn't know somebody with Parkinson's. And that's always that's humbling and that's frustrating as well. But I think again, the level of awareness is greatly increased with the onset of a lot of cures. There's also been some federal legislation that was adopted last year to focus on allocating funds for clinical research. And I've also been blessed. One of the other common findings is that I was diagnosed at age 49, so that was pretty young in terms of it definitely falls into the category of early onset Parkinson's disease. But that being said, having a diagnosis earlier in my adult life, the progression is much slower. So typically speaking, when you've been diagnosed in your 50s, the progression to increased symptoms in other areas are much more delayed. So for me, it's been over 10 years, and I'm starting to get a little more impacted than I have been historically, but still. 10 years in, I'm still able to do just about everything I want. So it's, there is a light at the end of that tunnel, and I'm under no illusions that it will progress and it will get worse. But again, very fortunate that I've had an opportunity to learn, to research, to really get involved, and hopefully make a difference and have a little bit of legacy when I pass. So
So, are there any ways that Parkinson's, you talked about the really great positive impact that it had on your children, but what about friends? How have friends reacted to you? I know you were diagnosed 10 years ago. If you think back to that time, did it impact your friendship groups, their understanding, your social life? Can you tell us about that?
yeah, I think much like my family, it increased their level of education and awareness. They definitely were clued into me about what to consider, and here's some of the challenges. And quite frankly, my biggest coping mechanism for the frustrations of Parkinson's disease is a good sense of humor, and you really have to have one. So when I think of all the crazy things that now impact me, of the number one enemy I face is buttons on a collared shirt, and being able to do things that was a lot easier in days past. But again, without a sense of humor, it's very difficult to manage the symptoms. But if you have a good sense of humor, you can pretty much get through it. And the reason why I mention that is it's always helpful when you're talking to friends and explaining to them disease. Bring a little bit of brevity to it. Have an opportunity to really focus on the highlights, and give people a more rounded education.
So, what about your career? I'm really interested to hear. Like you shared that you were early onset diagnosis at 49, so still really actively working and in the height of your career at the time. How has your diagnosis impacted on that for you?
I think it's not had a big impact thus far. I think, one thing that I'm pretty clear about is my desire to continue to work. I might not necessarily want to work in a, 9 to 5 kind of traditional hours. So I'm very keen in working with, advisory boards and working with employers, and I'm doing consulting now. So I want to stay active. I want to stay mentally healthy in terms of using that. But there's definitely accommodations. I'm a little more fatigued by the end of the day. One of my biggest compromises is I can no longer microtask like I used to. Had this been a decade ago, I'd be talking to you, I'd be on the computer, and I'd be listening to something on the phone. So multitasking is not an easy thing for someone with PD. So it's which is probably both a blessing and a curse. It's really forced me to kind of be engaged, focus, and try to take the issues one at a time.
As you say, 10 years ago, if you would have been that kind of person that got stimulated by doing all of those
Mm.
things, has it been frustrating, sort of adjusting to that, or has it been a bit liberating, like you say, to be able to just focus on one thing?
Yeah, a little of both, So a lot of the anxiety that comes along with that, there are some cognitive issues that are creeping up. I always often explain, the scenario of I get up from the living room and go into the kitchen, and I've completely forgotten what I'm there for. Although I've been noted, it's been confirmed that perhaps that's more of a symptom of older age that we all face, as opposed to someone with Parkinson's disease. But maybe it affects me just a wee bit more than the rest of the population.
So we talked about friendships and family. Do you mind talking about romantic relationships and how your diagnosis has impacted on that for you?
Yeah, it's obviously it's a subject that's a little bit sad for me. I've through the course of my disease, not because of the disease, but I've actually been divorced, and she was my caregiver, my soulmate, and everything that I kind of lived for, and I let things get away. I mean, some of the you know Parkinson's brought a little bit of selfishness on my part. And I can look at it through the eyes of a caregiver saying it's very difficult to live with somebody with Parkinson's disease. There's mood swings, there's frustrations, there's anger, there's sadness, there's depression. I mean, it's all part of the package. And I think it's a big ask for a caregiver. And, that wasn't the reason that, my relationship, kind of changed. But it clearly was one of the contributing factors. It's a unique challenge to place on caregivers, and it's a lot. So I mean, I appreciate that. And, it's just one of the challenges, one of the many gifts of Parkinson's that I'm, being able to deal with.
Yeah, there's so much we don't know for the person that's diagnosed, but also the impact that it does have, particularly on their loved one, their partner, who then has this change in dynamic and can become their caregiver. It is a huge thing, and I don't know if it is always talked about or recognised, or what support there is out there for people as they're going through this. So I think it's a really important thing for people to be aware of. So I also wanted to ask you about your experience of living with PD and your emotional well-being. Can you share with us any ways in which your diagnosis, your condition, has impacted your mental health?
Yeah, I think not so much my mental health per se. I mean, I had mentioned some, brief cognitive issues and other things that are, kind of, par for the course in terms of moving through the progression of disease. But, I think, it's been a bit lonely at times. I'm not in a work setting any longer right now, at least for right now. So I don't have that in direct stimulation and engagement of colleagues and peers. So I kind of miss that. And, I'm in this wonderful city and, I absolutely love Paris, but sometimes it's a challenge. It's, I lack the motivation to kind of get up and do something. And, it's a little bit of self-pity, I think. It's just one of the many emotions, to be very candid, of, disease, fighting with the disease and, trying to have a balance. But, it's not easy. There's, times, and I'm a very much a people person, just in terms of my engagement. And, so I miss that. So I think that's probably, one of the factors to call out.
Yeah, no, it's such a huge thing, isn't it? The physical diagnosis, the physical condition itself, but the impact that it can and does have emotionally as well.
Some of it's also self-fulfilling because, it's very easy to not do anything. And, sometimes when you have PD and the frustrations and my joints hurt, I'm tired, frustrated, I'm shaking a lot today, all the things that, potentially could impact you make it very easy to say, no, I'm not going to see those people. I'm not going to go to that event, or, I don't want to have to answer these questions. So, there's been, limited, not a lot, but, limited, instances of that being the case.
That was all of my questions, Peter. You've literally hit every single one really succinctly. So that's absolutely great. Thank you so much.